I'm so thrilled to have on author Timothy Boyce. Thank you so much for coming here.
Well, thank you for having me.
And sharing your book From Day to Day. Now, you're an attorney, you do a lot of other things, but for some reason you grabbed hold of this.
Yes.
And it is the story of a guy who's in a concentration camp and his 3.5 years and what happened to him.
Right, his diary.
How did you first come in contact with this diary of Nonsans?
Odd Nonsen. Yes.
Which is Norwegian.
Which is Norwegian, yes, very Norwegian. It was total serendipity, complete serendipity. I'm a fantastic reader, phenomenal reader. I like to read a lot, and I always have a book in my hand. And back in 2010, I saw a new book that had just come out. It was a memoir of a young boy who, in fact, one of the youngest survivors of Auschwitz, at age 10. His name was Thomas Bergenthal, and the name of his book was Lucky Child. And the title appealed to me. I knew nothing about it, but just from the title and the interest in history that I have, I decided to buy it at a bookstore and start reading it. And in that story, Bergenthal tells his survival, which was truly miraculous through a variety of incidents in various camps, including Sachsenhausen. And he mentions this Norwegian who he attributes to saving his life through various means, essentially Nonsen used his food to bribe the orderlies in the hospital ward where Tom was a young patient to make sure that Tom was not put on a selection list. And in literally a small footnote in that book, which is one sentence long, Tom Bergenthal says, by the way, this fellow Nonsen wrote a diary when he was a prisoner as well, and he published it first in Norwegian and then in English. It was translated in 1949 under the title From Day to Day. I just looked it up on the internet to see if I could find an old copy. I found one copy in English for sale in the United States. It was just amazing to me that there were so few copies. I ordered it.
What did you pay for it?
Well, since it's so rare, I ended up paying, I think, about $150 for it.
A life story over 3.5 years in a concentration camp. That doesn't sound like a lot of money.
Well, for used books, it is a lot of money.
Right.
But I had no hesitation doing that because I was
fascinated by this.
I was just fascinated. I thought, well, Tom Bergenthal's memoir has been quite interesting. This diary has got to be it seems to me, equally interesting, although I confess I knew nothing about Nonsen, knew none of his background or where he was from or what Norway's role in the war was, but it just fascinated me. It piqued my interest. And so as I say, I ordered it, started reading it, and before I had even gotten maybe halfway through it, the thought kept occurring to me, how can a book that I'm finding to be one of the most powerful books I've ever read, so eloquent, so cinematic in his descriptions of these scenes that he's describing, not be in print for over 60 years now? I mean, given how many other books seem to find their way into print all the time, this thing is a masterpiece. And before I got to the end of it, I said to myself, I don't know how I'm going to do this, since I am just an attorney, I'm not in the publishing world. I'm going to figure out how to get this book back in print if it takes me forever. And I did everything probably the wrong way because I didn't know what I was doing, what I was getting into. But I finally, through really perseverance and some strokes of good fortune along the way, I finally found a publisher and brought it out.
Why did you want his words to get out there again?
Because I wanted people to read what I read. I was so moved by his eloquence and by the fact that Nonsen was able to maintain his humanity in the most inhumane conditions possible. Everybody else was essentially looking out for themselves, just trying to survive, which wouldn't blame anybody for doing that in a concentration camp. And yet Nonsen did more than that. He looked out for other people. And one prime example of this is he looked out for young Tom Bergenthal, and again, saved his life by intervening in him when he could have easily have walked by Tom. Tom was at that point in a hospital bed, having just recovered from having several of his toes amputated because of frostbite that he had suffered and experienced after taking part in the Auschwitz death march. Nonsen could have walked by and said, this kid doesn't stand a chance of surviving. And I don't even know him. I mean, I've never even met him. He's not even Norwegian. Why should I get involved? But he got involved, and he saved Tom's life. And Tom went on to a spectacularly successful career as a lawyer and an expert on international human rights. So
We should talk about how Nansen ended up in a concentration camp and go back in time for us a little bit.
Well, Nansen came from an extremely famous family, one of the most famous families in all of Norway, the Nonsan family. His father, Fridtjof Nansen, was a polar explorer, he was a statesman, he was a humanitarian, he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. So you're talking about one of the first families of Norway. And also a family that is very closely tied and aligned with the royal family. They were close friends and had been close friends since Fridtjof Nansen convinced Prince Carl of Denmark to become the king of Norway. I mean, that's about as close as you can possibly get in terms of a friendship. So Nansen had a high profile, and through a series of events that occurred in late 1941, the Germans wanted to get back at the royal family. Germans, of course, had occupied Norway in 1940. They wanted to get back at the royal family, but the royal family was now in exile. So what to do? Why not arrest all of the high-profile Norwegians who are very close to the royal family and hold them as hostages? And Nansen was one of the 20 hostages who were rounded up in January of 1942 and arrested and kept in. He was the only one of those 20 kept in captivity for the remainder of the war. Everybody else was released at some point or another. But that was the origin of his incarceration.
So he was in a concentration camp in Norway and also went to Germany as well.
Yes, for about half the time he was in Norway, and then in August of 1943 he was sent to Germany, essentially because he was one of these people who would not keep his mouth shut. He would tell his German captors, "You're going to lose the war. Morally you're on the wrong side of all these positions." And I think he became a thorn in their side. And he was finally summoned, and the commandant said, "We will show you what a real concentration camp is like. We're sending you to Germany. You might as well tell your family you're not coming back."
Are you surprised in his writings that he wasn't killed? With being as outspoken as he was?
Yes, it could easily. One of the things you learn if you do enough research in the Holocaust is that everybody, the difference between survival and perishing was pure luck. And he could easily have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or said one more thing to the commandant that finally, broke the camel's back. Could easily have been executed for any number of reasons. He could have gotten a sickness, disease. I mean, you get an infection. There was no medicines in these camps. So
I have been to Auschwitz, and it is haunting to walk,
to say the least,
the halls, to walk the areas where people were put to death, where they would walk to areas where they would be, and they knew this, where they would be executed, and to hear shots off in the distance, to see the piles of suitcases and shoes and combs and hair, everything they took away from them, and the gruel that they ate. He talked about that in his diaries. How was it that he was able to hide it and to get it out
to hide the
world?
diary? Yes. Well, while he was in Norway, which was again for about the first 18 months of his incarceration, he was able to smuggle the diary out pretty easily because the camp was rather porous. You had Norwegians coming in virtually every day, bringing in food supplies, construction materials, repairmen, and they were all sympathetic to the prisoners. So he would be able to slip into a couple of pages of the diary into a person's pocket, roll it up hide it in a cigarette, put it in a tin can and leave it outside.
But risky all the same?
Risky, undoubtedly, it was always risky. When he gets to Germany, the stakes are even higher because there's no one there who's going to help him smuggle this diary out of the camp. While he's in the camp, it was fairly easy to hide it because he says, I put it in places that no German would ever look, primarily in the privy, to be honest. They didn't set foot in the privy if they could help it. But he realized that he was not going to be able to get it out of the camp very easily. But he writes in his diary, psychologically, this has become so important to me, I'm going to keep writing it, even though I don't know how I'm going to get it out of the camp. And if I have to bury it in the ground when we leave, I'll do that. And diaries have been found buried in the ground in Auschwitz, not necessarily in Sachsenhausen. But finally, he had a brainstorm, and he realized that the two items that every prisoner had, no matter how poor they were, was a tin cup. You had to have a tin cup to drink water and soup and liquids, and a breadboard. In your breadboard, you receive your bread ration in the morning from the head of your barracks, and you'd use that as your table, your work area, whatever. And he realized that he could actually go to a carpenter friend of his in the carpentry shop, which, because there was many workshops in the camp, and have it split open and he hollowed out the inside of his breadboard and hid these pages, which were tissue-thin paper, almost like onion skin, which he wrote, and of course he wrote microscopically small lettering for this, to the point where after the war, when he had the actual handwritten diary transcribed, the secretaries needed a magnifying glass to read his handwriting. But he, at the end of the war, he and 5 of his Norwegian friends walked out with their breadboards, and nobody even asked them about it because, of course, it was so ubiquitous, no one even think about asking to look at it. And that's how all of it was smuggled in toto.
It's amazing that you could even think about doing things like that, because every day in a concentration camp was, how can I survive
exactly
one more day?
That's right.
The way they slept in bunks that were claustrophobic.
Yes, several racks high.
Cold, damp.
Yes.
Tell me about some of the passages that he wrote about in the coldest times.
Well, of course, there's many, and I have been to Sachsenhausen. I visited Sachsenhausen in October of 2015, and I tried to stand out on the roll call area. And of course, I was wearing a fleece jacket and warm pants and heavy socks, and I tried to stand out there as long as I could. And it was only after about 15 minutes that I started feeling cold. And he talks about incidents where sometimes prisoners were made to stand for 24 hours. And they would freeze to death. Some of them would literally freeze to death as punishment for smoking in the barracks. That was one time prisoners actually burned down a barracks by accident because somebody was smoking inside. So as punishment, the Germans had all the prisoners stand at attention for 24 hours, and many of them perished that way. So I could only stand 15 minutes, and so I can only imagine what it would be like for some of these prisoners wearing nothing but essentially cotton pajamas.
How did getting his words out to the world again change your life?
Well, it changed my life I guess in 2 ways. First, for the last 6 years now, 7 years, I've been obsessed with this project and have become something of an expert on Norwegian history, certainly an expert on Odd Nansen. I don't think there's anybody in the States who knows more about his life than I do, because I've immersed myself in it. I've become much more conversant in all of the issues dealing with the Holocaust. So in that sense, something I'd never expected to be doing in 2010, the last 6, 7 years,
never
all
in
I've
your
been
wildest
doing.
imagination.
Never thought I would, just plopped on my lap and I did it. The other thing is, I hope that learning about Nansen as I have, I think I've become a slightly better person. I've tried to model myself or my actions or my reactions after him. I mean, people often say, you know, what would Jesus do? Now I say, what would Odd Nansen do? Because he did some incredible things. He really helped people all the time. He was always thinking of not himself, of others. And to me, that's the most inspiring thing of all.
How did his family receive you?
Well, they, right from the get-go, they were very, very forthcoming. It was really, originally when I decided I wanted to write this book, the first person I contacted actually was Thomas Bergenthal, because at that point he had just retired from the International Court of Justice at The Hague and had come back to the United States. This was in the fall of 2010, and I met with him in his offices at George Washington Law School, where he was teaching at that point, in January of 2011. Of course, we talked about his book for a while, and then I said, by the way, I've got this idea percolating to try to bring the diary back to print. What do you think about that? And he said, I will help you, support you in any way I possibly can. If you can get a publisher, I will write the preface to the book, which he has written the preface to this book. And he says, I will introduce you to Nonsens' children, who I've been good friends with ever since the war ended.
Because they were forever linked.
They were forever linked. And so he wrote a letter of introduction to Nonsens' eldest daughter, Marit. And she's the family historian. She's the keeper of the flame. And
still in Norway?
Still in Norway, 87 years old, and mind like a steel trap. She remembers everything. She was 13 years old the night her father was arrested, and she can paint the picture of exactly where everybody was in the room, what they were doing, what happened. And she has answered literally hundreds and hundreds of emails that I've asked her questions. Who is Nansen talking about when he just uses a first name in this diary entry that I can't otherwise link to anybody else? What does he mean by this phrase when he calls you the Fisker girl? You know, well, they love to go fishing together, so that was his nickname for her. Many things that without her, I would never be able to figure them all out. And so I've become very, very close with Mara. She actually came to the United States in 2012, and was a house guest of my wife and I in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Wow.
And she's just terrific. She is absolutely terrific. And I can't wait to go back to Norway, hopefully this fall, to be with her now that the book is finally out.
It's a hefty book.
It's a very hefty book.
It's an amazing read at a life in a concentration camp, 3.5 years. Now you're doing something interesting with the monies from this book.
Yes, when I met with Tom Bergenthal in 2011 and I explained what my project was, I also mentioned, I kind of made my mind almost from the get-go, I was doing this for people to read the book and share the experience that I had had. I did not want people to think of this as I was getting in this for a money-making motive. And so I decided right from the get-go that I would donate all the royalties that I otherwise would earn under my publishing agreement to a charity or charities that I thought Nonsans would have approved of, for various reasons. Part of that was the work product is Nonsans. It's not my work product, and so I shouldn't really be profiting from it. Secondly, I learned in my research about Nonsan and his life that when he had his diary originally issued in Norwegian and then in 1949 translated into English, but it was also translated into German. And Nonsan gave away the proceeds of the German translation to German refugees after the war. Now here's a man, again, who has been brutalized by German SS guards for over 3.5 years. And he turns around and says, these German refugees need the money more than I do. And so he gives away the proceeds to the refugees. So I felt I couldn't do no less than follow his example. So after consulting with Nonsans children again and discussing my desire to do this, we jointly decided that 50% of all the royalties will go to the U.S. Holocaust Museum in D.C. and 50% will go to the Jewish Museum in Oslo. So I'm waiting for my first royalty check to be able to make a distribution, but that's forthcoming.
What a moment that will be. Now, what's going to happen in Washington?
Well, we've been, of course, doing a lot of marketing for the book, and I'm excited to announce that we have worked out a date where the U.S. Holocaust Museum is going to sponsor an event highlighting the publication of this book, and the venue for it is going to be the Norwegian Embassy in D.C., and Thomas Bergenthal and I will be the joint guests, and we will be interviewed by one of the directors of the Holocaust Museum, Michael Abramowitz. So it's going to be a terrific evening. I've never done anything with Tom Bergenthal on the same stage, so I think it'll be truly amazing. I mean, this book was dedicated to Tom. In the dedication page, Nonsan dedicated to young Tommy, even though he didn't know whether he had survived the camps at that point. And now here's 65 years later, Bergenthal has returned the favor by writing the preface to the new edition, and I'm going to be on the stage discussing with him. I can't imagine a greater thrill.
How amazing that one passage.
One footnote.
One footnote.
Yes, has changed my life.
Because you chased this down.
Yes.
And now you figure into his life.
Yes.
And are a witness to history. Is this the last diary you're going to get out into the world?
Well, I don't know where I'm going to go from this. I love to annotate this. That's what I did. I edited it and I annotated it. I've also learned so much about various things that I do have some projects in mind that I would like to pursue. In fact, I'm hoping to go to the Yale Library while I'm up in Connecticut for the next few days and start doing some research on...
Any hints?
Well, I think it would deal with the plight of refugees in Europe in the interwar period, much of which the same issues are being addressed by Europe all over again at the present time. So there's a certain kind of resonance with that.
What kind of law did you practice?
I was a real estate finance attorney.
Okay, so this has nothing to do with
No, it's about as far afield as you could possibly be, although I always wanted to be an author at some point in my life, a nonfiction author.
And now you are, and I would say that this is only the beginning of this journey, perhaps.
I hope so.
The book has been out just a short amount of time.
It was first issued on April 25th, so it's only been a couple of months now, and I've enjoyed every day of this that I've been working on it. It's the most enjoyable and rewarding and enriching thing I've ever done in my life. So I wake up every morning just thinking, what can I work on today about this?
Well, thank you for sharing his story, your joy with us from day to day. Timothy, thank you so much for coming on and enlightening us about this.
It was entirely my pleasure.
And get the book. It's amazing.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
When will this end? Who's this girl? Spend all night kissing and the bottle's right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked to find myself wishing to find the keys to the door, but it's also a metaphor. Need to keep locked in the grocery store of a mind. Just to say